Good evening, traveler. You've wandered into myth-taken dreams, a place where timelines tangle, truths wobble, and bedtime stories rewrite history just enough to make it magical. Each tale unfolds from a library that never existed, where historians whisper with poets and facts arrive fashionably late. Tonight, we unspool another tale from the flickering archive because bedtime deserves a version of history to pique the imagination. So fluff your pillow, turn down the logic, and lean into the lore. Once upon a time, in a world full of wild, untamed nature and animals that had absolutely no interest in being pets, there lived a group of rather adventurous creatures called hunter-gatherers. Now, these weren't your typical couch potatoes. Oh no, they were constantly on the move, running around, looking for things to eat, and trying to avoid being eaten by something else. It was like living in an eternal scavenger hunt, only with much higher stakes and a lot more trees. These hunter-gatherers were pretty good at what they did. They had sharp tools made out of rocks and sticks, and they were experts at tracking animals through forests, fields, and the occasional swamp. But while they were great at finding food, there was one small issue. Food didn't always stick around when you wanted it to. Sometimes there would be a very good berry bush, but then the berries would be gone because, apparently, everyone else in the neighborhood had also noticed how delicious it was. And sometimes the animals they'd been hunting were way too fast to catch, or even worse, too good at running into dangerous places like swamps. Very inconvenient. One day, as luck would have it, the hunter-gatherers were hanging out by a river, chewing on some grass, which, by the way, they'd recently realized wasn't half bad, when something extraordinary happened. It wasn't an asteroid, or a volcano, or a particularly angry bear, though they were all pretty familiar with those. No, this was something much subtler, an idea. And like all great ideas, it was a little weird at first, and no one really knew what to make of it. It started with a very curious, very bored individual named Steve. Now, Steve wasn't the tallest or the fastest. He wasn't even particularly great at throwing rocks at things, which, in fairness, was a pretty big deal in those days. But Steve had something that set him apart, a mind that liked to wonder. One day, while sitting by the river and lazily tossing a stone into the water, Steve had a thought. What if we didn't have to hunt for food all the time? What if food just came to us? Now, most of the other hunter-gatherers heard this and immediately thought, well, that's a funny idea, Steve. What next? Should we all go back to playing who can climb the tallest tree? But Steve was persistent. He started experimenting. What if I just leave these seeds right here? And then I come back later and see what happens. He did this with some wild grass seeds, and to his surprise, after a while, the seeds sprouted. Tiny green plants grew up, as if the earth itself had decided, sure, Steve, why not? Now, this might seem like a pretty modest beginning after all. Plants grow all the time. But here's the thing. Steve had stumbled upon a revolutionary idea, one that would change the course of history and probably make his name legendary, if only someone had written things down back then. That didn't happen, but we're doing our best here. Steve wasn't content with just a couple of plants. He started to experiment more, leaving seeds in different places and watering them with the very advanced technique of gently splashing water on them with his hands. And lo and behold, more plants grew, and the best part. Steve didn't have to run around chasing them. They were right there, waiting for him to come back. After a few seasons, Steve became known as Steve the Grower, and while he still didn't have the best aim with a spear, he was starting to get really good at growing things. The other hunter-gatherers began to notice. They looked at Steve's fields, they looked at their empty stomachs, and they thought, you know, maybe that Steve fellows onto something. So, after a lot of grumbling and probably some very dramatic speeches about tradition and the good old days, the other hunter-gatherers decided to give it a go. they started planting more things. They learned how to grow not just grass, which was good for making bread, kind of, but also beans, wheat, and even some early forms of corn. They learned that if they watered the plants, they grew bigger. And if they protected the plants from those pesky animals that loved to nibble on them, there would be more food. It was like magic, except it was just science, which was much better in the long run. Over time, the hunter-gatherers transformed into something much more settled. They stopped wandering around looking for food and started staying in one place where they could have all their plants growing just outside their door. And because they weren't spending all their time running through forests, they had time to invent other things like houses and, eventually, cooking. There were still some people who weren't fully convinced, but soon enough, most of them saw the benefits of not having to chase after a deer for 3 days just to end up with a couple of ribs and a lot of disappointment. This new way of life was called agriculture, which, if you ask anyone who has ever tried to plant a garden, is just a fancy word for. You grow things, and sometimes you grow more things than you can eat, and then you get to share them with everyone else who decided that chasing things was a little too much effort. The agricultural revolution wasn't as explosive as an asteroid hitting the Earth, but it was just as important. It meant humans didn't have to rely on their luck and their ability to outrun a lion anymore. Instead, they could grow their own food, which meant they had more time to think up other revolutionary ideas, like the wheel, pottery, and, eventually, pizza. And so, thanks to Steve, who, by the way, never got the credit he deserved because no one thought to give him a medal, humanity began the journey from wandering around being really good at avoiding things that wanted to eat them, to settling down, farming, and eventually building things like cities, the internet, and, yes, farms where people grew enough carrots to make a really good stew. The end, or the beginning of something much, much bigger. Again.